So I have the dubious honor of trying to animate you and inform you so that you can go out tomorrow to advocate with your senators and representatives. And I think the best starting place for us is the question that I always ask myself of why do I keep advocating for immigration reform year after year when, to be perfectly honest, oftentimes things seem to get worse instead of better. And my answer to the question is, if you can go to the next slide, is because of women like Ruby. I met Ruby several times. In a moment we'll see a photo, when we switch slides, we'll see a photo of her kids. There we go. So on the left you can see Ruby's 3 children. They all live in Atlanta, Georgia. Ruby stayed in our women's shelter on 3 different occasions, trying to cross the border and get back to her kids, because all that she wanted was for her kids to have a mom again. When I talked with her the 4th time that she was staying, the 4th time that she had been deported, and asked her what she was going to do next, and she said, "I don't see an alternative. I'm going to cross the border because I believe that one day I will be again with my children." I have to advocate for immigration reform because if Ruby hasn't given up, then I certainly don't have the privilege or the right to give up on Ruby. And so I'd encourage you all to go out with that same attitude of persistence. If you're in high school, it might be many years that you're visiting the Hill and trying to encourage our legislators to have a more humane and just approach for immigration. But that's okay, because there will still be people like Ruby who are crossing the border, and they still need you to advocate for them. I also advocate for immigration reform because I recognize that women like Ruby are right now facing Customs and Border Protection in full riot gear, which is what they're bringing out at the moment at our ports of entry. This is a photo of one of the Customs and Border Protection officers stationed right now at the ports. I'm embarrassed that the response of our country to women like Ruby and other people in need is to treat this issue as a military issue. So I would encourage you to continue to be persistent and to recognize your responsibility tomorrow. You might have heard there's an election on Tuesday. So we're going at quite an interesting moment where you have the opportunity you're talking to an office that for the last several months has been thinking obsessively about Tuesday, and your challenge tomorrow is to make them think beyond. Make them think about what's going to happen on Wednesday after the election, no matter which direction the election goes. How are these offices going to choose to act on Wednesday? So there's a couple of different pieces of immigration that I'd like you to encourage you to focus on. The first is the very immediate. If we can go to the next slide, the appropriations. The appropriations are a really big word for funding, basically. Essential principle of advocacy is that the government can't do anything if it doesn't have the money to do it. So your job tomorrow is to explain to your senators and representatives what your taxpayers' dollars should be spent on. Because between Wednesday and December 7th, the government has to pass a funding bill for the Department of Homeland Security. If the funding expires December 7th, so there will be some measure to continue the budget. And what we want to encourage our senators and representatives to do is to vote to reduce funding for immigration detention beds, reduce funding for Border Patrol and Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents, and reduce funding for border security infrastructure, including the wall. In case that's a little bit too complicated, you can just remember, no boots, no beds, no wall. Those are your 3 areas of focus when it comes to funding. And for those of you who want to get a little bit more technical, so the big picture is, let's not fund an infrastructure or continue to increase funding to an infrastructure that's harming our families and communities. If you want to get a little bit more technical, one of the actions that Immigration and Customs Enforcement has done over the course of the last year is that we actually have been very successful in preventing some of those increases of funding. So Immigration and Customs Enforcement has been pulling from other pots of money to try to detain more people than they're funded to detain. They've been detaining on average 2,000 more people a day than they have the funding for. So you can also explain that to your legislatures, to your senators and representatives, and encourage them to put some restrictions on that funding so that Immigration and Customs Enforcement can't so easily supplement their budget to put people like, for those of you who heard from Freddy's yesterday, to have funding to put people like Freddy's in detention. So reducing funding and restricting the mobility of those funds are two goals for appropriations. This is a very urgent topic because this is going to make a difference in how we approach immigration in 2019 if we can convince our senators and representatives to act before December 7th. There's another piece of news that's been around. So other than appropriations, which we'll be pushing on tomorrow, you might have heard of the caravan. So there's several thousand people, probably somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people who have fled Central America, primarily Honduras, and are in southern Mexico right now. We actually like to call them the Exodus. It's a little bit more biblical, a little more appropriate, especially from our Catholic perspective. And what I'd like to encourage you all to do tomorrow is think about how can we reframe the narrative of this Exodus. This will be the topic that your offices are thinking about for the next month, that they're talking about, that they're seeing on the news. So encourage your congresspeople, sorry, there's a typo. Encourage your congresspeople to speak publicly about their approach to the Exodus and to speak publicly in a humanizing way so that they can have better oversight over the way that the Trump administration is responding. We want to make sure that our senators and representatives are equipped to reinforce that we have a moral, we have a legal, we have an ethical, we have a theological obligation to protect people who are fleeing from violence. It's quite natural for our congresspeople to feel a little overwhelmed, to say, well, it seems like a pretty big group of people. The way that we want to reframe that narrative is we want to emphasize the way that communities have been welcoming this exodus along the journey. It's been absolutely incredible in southern Mexico to see people give tortillas, beans, what little they have in order to support people in need as they're along the journey. I think that we can, with all of the resources we have in the country, do at least as well as southern Mexico. And so we want to give that picture to our senators and representatives, that there actually is a potential for our communities to rise up and offer to support people as they arrive and enter into these asylum processes. So that's the narrative we want, is to emphasize the ways that communities have stepped up and welcomed, and that the United States community will also step up and it will also welcome. It's not just a government issue, it's an issue of community and NGO support. And then the final way that we want to reframe the narrative of the caravan is to communicate how the border is a vibrant place of meeting. The border is a place where people are crossing back and forth all the time to go to work, to go to school, to go shopping, to buy tortillas, and emphasize that that's the picture of the border that's consistent with our Catholic values. We see a border where we see church meeting and extending and growing and flourishing. That's what we celebrate at the Kino Border Initiative. And I'd encourage you to mention that to your senators and representatives, that when you think of border, you're not thinking of a wall that divides, but of a port that unites. So I encourage you to mention these different pieces in connection with the Exodus, again, to prepare your congressperson to speak out publicly in support of humane treatment for those who are arriving at our borders. And then the final piece of immigration policy that we're going to focus on is really staying focused on this broader vision. Again, remember the persistence of Ruby. We desperately need legal protections for youth who have deferred action for childhood arrival status, for families from Central America with temporary protected status. We need legal protections for those who have already made their lives in the US, for those who have kids at our Jesuit schools. So encourage your legislators to continue to think about comprehensive immigration reform or compassionate immigration reform that provides pathways to legal status for those individuals. We also need to respect the rights of people to have life in their own communities. Our goal is not for everybody to come to the United States, because most of the people that I talk to don't want to be in the United States. Our goal is for people to have safety and dignity, economic dignity, as well as safety from violence in their own communities, and for us to be a part of that process by cutting some of our harmful aid to Central America, as well as supporting Central Americans, supporting economic development in Central America, and providing reasonable pathways for people to enter the United States legally. When we can really cast this broader vision of what it would look like to have a humane and just immigration system, it transforms our idea of what the role of enforcement is. When I think about what immigration and customs enforcement could be, I think about a deportation officer whose job was supposed to be to deport this man from Honduras who was seeking asylum, and instead who encouraged him to stick with the legal process, encouraged him to go through court, encouraged him not to give up his rights, and was a motivating force for that young man to stay in detention for several months, until on Wednesday he won his asylum case within detention. So let's re-envision the role of these agencies, let's re-envision the role of our immigration system, and we can actually have incredible, compassionate people who respect dignity in immigration and customs enforcement or customs and border protection, who are promoting rights and protecting people instead of dividing families and harming communities. And I am so excited to have you, all of you, be a part of casting that vision to your senators and your representatives. Thank you.